Previously, our traveler found themselves ensnared in something far beyond a haunting. Doors that led to yesterday, voices that called them by a name they couldn't remember, footsteps that followed without form or face. Now, they search for answers in the only way left, by reaching across the veil. In this chapter, they'll sit in the cold silence of the ship's belly, surrounded by mediums and skeptics, candles flickering against walls that remember too much. And when the seance begins, the ship answers. But some truths, once spoken, can never be taken back. This is part 2 of our story aboard the Queen Mary. And if you thought being lost in time was terrifying, wait until you find out why the ship won't let go. It was just past what should have been nightfall, though time no longer held its form aboard the Queen Mary. The clocks refused to agree with one another, and the sun, when visible, bled a tired gray that never quite reached daylight or dusk. I had stopped checking my phone. The signal was long gone. The screen occasionally blinked static between app icons, as though caught between two systems, one digital, the other. Older, much older. I had tried to leave, over and over. Every exit returned me to a version of the ship that seemed deeper, more intrusive, more sentient. She was adjusting to me now, testing me, tuning her corridors to my reactions, and the more I fought, the closer I came to her core. It was sometime during what I thought was my 3rd morning that I ran into her. Not her, the ship. Her, the woman. Clara. At least, that's what she said her name was. She sat in the old music room, one of the few places that hadn't changed in days. Still covered in dust. Still lit by an amber chandelier that crackled faintly overhead. Clara wore a blue dress, elegant, old-fashioned. Not quite period accurate, but close. Her eyes, though, were unmistakably modern, sharp and haunted. "You look like someone the ship won't let go," she said without turning her head. "She's chosen you." I approached carefully, unsure if she was real or just another echo stitched into the Queen Mary's folds. "I thought I was alone," I said. "No one's ever alone on this ship," Clara replied, finally looking up. "They just think they are." She gestured to the bench beside her. I hesitated, then sat. "What is this place?" I asked. "She's not just a ship," she said, running a finger over the dusty keys of the baby grand piano. "She's a vessel, in more ways than one. People think the Queen Mary just ferried soldiers and tourists, but she carried more than that. Grief, desperation, pain." Clara looked at me then, and some things linger when they have nowhere else to go. I asked how she got here. She didn't answer, just stood and walked to a cabinet against the far wall. Inside was a weathered box, wrapped in red cloth, tied with a silver chain. "She doesn't like to be ignored," Clara whispered, cradling the box. "But she'll answer, if we ask." I stared at the box. "What is that?" Clara looked down at it, as though surprised it was even there. An offering, a connection. And then she said something I hadn't expected. "Tonight we hold seance." I didn't respond. She lit candles, 6 of them, perfectly arranged in a circle around the piano bench. Each flickered as though pressed by an unseen breath. Clara knelt at the center. She motioned for me to sit opposite her, across the circle. I obeyed. Her fingers trembled slightly as she undid the chain around the box. Inside were 4 items: a faded photograph of a little girl on the deck of the ship, a rusted medallion with the Queen Mary's insignia, a broken watch stopped at 3:47, and a strand of what looked like dark brown hair, tied with a white ribbon. "She needs to remember," Clara said. "This helps her remember." I wanted to ask who she was, but I already knew. The ship. or whatever had embedded itself into the ship's bones. We joined hands. The candles burned lower, spitting faint streams of smoke. A low hum filled the room, not from any speaker or intercom, but from beneath the floor, like a great engine resuming its breath. "Spirits aboard the Queen Mary," Clara began, voice low and steady. "We come not to mock, not to disturb, but to listen, to understand, to witness. If you are here, let yourselves be known." Silence. Then the piano behind me creaked. I turned. No one there? I turned back. The candles had grown taller. Somehow, impossibly, the wax rose upward. Clara didn't flinch. She tightened her grip. "Who's with us?" she asked. A gust swept the room, strong enough to knock over a chair in the corner, yet the flames on the candles never wavered. They stayed straight, unmoved, and then a voice, male, low, desperate, not from the room, but from inside my head. "Trapped," I gasped. Clara's eyes widened. "What do you see?" The room began to blur. No longer the music room. Now it was the infirmary again. But older, more blood, more chaos. A nurse stood hunched in the corner, her hands trembling, her mouth open, but no sound came out. She pointed toward the hallway, and I followed. Each door I passed bore a name. Crew members, soldiers, civilians. Some were scratched out, others bled fresh ink like wounds. The final door was different. Solid black. A number etched into it. 347. The same time on the broken watch. I opened it, and the cold hit me. Bone deep. I was in the meat locker, only. It wasn't the kitchen. Bodies hung from the ceiling, rows of them, unmoving, eyes wide. They turned, one by one, to face me. And in unison, they whispered, "She doesn't forget." I stumbled back into the seance room. Clara was screaming. Her eyes rolled back, blood trickled from her nose. "Stop it!" I yelled. "End it!" But she wasn't there anymore. Only her body. The ship had taken her, used her. And what remained was still staring at me. "I remember you," it said through Clara's voice. And then every candle in the room exploded. I woke up in the hallway. No sign of Clara, no box, no candles, only the faint smell of burnt wax and the sound of water dripping from somewhere above. I ran, this time not to escape, but to find the truth. Whatever haunted the Queen Mary had spoken, and it knew me now. If you thought this tale was chilling, wait until you hear what's lurking in the next state. Hit subscribe to MindFuel and fuel your nightmares with every spine-tingling upload. There are moments when the mind fractures, not in a sudden, shattering way, but like ice under pressure, slowly, relentlessly, until the surface you trusted gives way, revealing the dark, frigid current beneath. I'd been aboard the Queen Mary for what felt like weeks, though the ship had long since severed its ties to the outside world. It no longer mattered what day it was, what time, or even what year. There was only here, only her. After the seance, things changed. The corridors stayed darker, even when the lights flickered back on. My footsteps echoed a fraction too late, as if someone or something was trailing me just out of sight. The air hung heavier, as though the very walls were exhaling, waiting. But more than that, the ship had started remembering me. Or perhaps it was the other way around. It began with small details. I passed a hallway I swore I'd never seen before, but felt unmistakably familiar. The smell of oil and rust made something stir in my stomach. A memory not mine, not fully, but rooted deep. I brushed my hand against a wall, and a sharp pain ran through my palm. When I looked, there was no cut, but I could still feel the sting. I stopped sleeping. Not because I couldn't, because each time I closed my eyes, I saw images I couldn't explain. A storm, Men shouting, a steel door buckling under water pressure, and always, the same face in the mirror. Mine, but not as I am now. Younger, dressed in a different era's uniform, covered in soot and sea spray, eyes wide with dread. Eventually, I stopped wandering and started searching. I'd heard rumors of sealed-off decks, areas the public never saw, boarded up after World War II, or after the incident with the Curacoa, or for reasons no one ever seemed willing to elaborate on. And like everything on this ship, those stories came with just enough truth to make the denial feel like a lie. It was on the third level below the engine room that I found it. A hatch, rusted shut, padlocked 3 times over. No signs, no warnings. But it called to me, like a breath drawn inward, waiting to exhale my name. I should have left it alone, but I didn't. I found a crowbar in a maintenance closet and began working on the locks. They weren't new, more ceremonial than functional, almost like they'd been placed there to make the point, you are not supposed to come back. One by one, they gave way. The hatch creaked open, and the stench hit me, salt, oil, and something older, like earth after it's been disturbed for the first time in decades. I descended the ladder. The darkness swallowed me immediately. Even my flashlight dimmed. I reached a corridor, low ceiling, walls slick with condensation. On one side, there were iron doors, each labeled only by numbers. On the other side, a long mirror, fractured in the center, spidering outward, and beneath my feet, tracks, footprints in the dust, identical to mine. I followed them. The corridor sloped gently downward, tighter with each step. I felt the walls narrowing. The air grew thick with pressure. Then I found the room. No door. Just an archway, as if the ship's steel had been forced apart like clay, revealing a chamber beyond. Inside, a desk, an oil lantern still flickering, and a single bunk, empty. But what drew me forward was the wall. It was covered in etchings, hundreds, no thousands of tallies, names, dates. But at the center, scrawled in deep gouges as though clawed by fingernails, was a name. My name. The exact spelling, and the number beneath it. 1943. I backed away, heart pounding. The room began to hum, and then I saw it, my reflection in the polished brass panel beside the bunk. It wasn't me. Not now. It was the other man, the one from my dreams, covered in grime, wearing a Royal Navy crewman's uniform, blood on his collar. His eyes met mine, wide with fear. And then he spoke, without moving his lips. "You stayed behind." I staggered backward. The brass rippled, and suddenly I was somewhere else. A memory, but not a memory I owned. The ship rocked violently. Sirens wailed. Men ran past me, yelling about a collision. Water rushed in from the lower decks. I turned toward the bulkhead. There were hands pounding from the other side. Trapped crew. One voice, screaming my name. I froze, unable to move, paralyzed by terror. I could have opened the hatch, could have saved them, but I didn't. I ran, and the door sealed behind me. The pounding stopped moments later. I fell to my knees, sobbing, because I felt it now. All of it. The guilt, the horror, the weight of lives lost, not to war, but to me. The vision shattered. I was back in the chamber, shaking, alone, but not empty. Something had filled me, memories, regret, recognition, and in that moment I understood. I hadn't just been lured here. I had returned. Not to uncover the ship's secrets, but to remember my own. This place, this entity, had waited for me to find my way. Back. And now that I had, it wasn't going to let me go. I walked out of the chamber and up through the ship's belly, not as a visitor, not as an outsider, but as something the Queen Mary had claimed long ago. And for the first time since I boarded, I didn't feel like a stranger. I felt like I belonged. If you thought this tale was chilling, wait until you hear what's lurking in the next state. Hit subscribe to MindFuel and fuel your nightmares with every spine-tingling upload. It's difficult to pinpoint the moment when you stop believing in rescue. There's no loud noise, no flash of insight. Just a soft surrender, like water soaking into wood, slow and permanent. I'd reached that point, for all the screams that echoed through the bowels of this vessel, for every shadow that lingered longer than it should. I'd never once truly believed I was alone. But now, as I stood on the threshold between history and hallucination, something told me this wasn't about escape anymore. It was about release. Not mine, theirs. I don't know how the woman found me, or if she'd ever truly left. She called herself Isla. Dressed in 1940s garb, her voice had the cadence of another century. Yet, there was a lucidity in her eyes that made her feel present, anchored. Not a vision, not a flickering echo like the others. She appeared in the radio room just after midnight. I'd been watching the equipment pulse uselessly in the dark, static whispering through the speakers like waves hissing on an invisible shore. "You've stirred them," she said softly, "more than anyone in years." I didn't ask who they were. I already knew. "The ones who couldn't leave," she continued. "The ones forgotten by time. Some are echoes, but others are fragments. Their pain hangs here like rust in the air." She approached the console and ran her hand along the edge. "There's a way to set them free, but it must be done properly, completely. Otherwise," her voice trailed off, "otherwise you join them." She didn't say it. She didn't need to. We gathered what we needed, or rather, what she said we'd need. Salt, a length of rope from the lifeboat deck, coal from the furnace room, an old officer's cap, and the candle from the stateroom where the lights never turned off. Each item was steeped in memory. Each carried its own weight, heavier than it seemed. The place she chose for the ritual was unexpected. The first-class swimming pool. Once a symbol of leisure and luxury, it now sat like a drowned cathedral. The water had long since been drained, but moisture lingered in the air. You could feel the cold pressing against your lungs. The tiles glistened, slick with unseen dew. The silence was immense. She led me down the narrow steps into the empty basin and told me to sit. She circled the edge of the pool, placing the items in the corners of what she called the reckoning square. An old term, she explained, something used to confront restless souls, to invite them to speak and to listen. I held the candle. She lit it with an old match. The flame quivered violently. Then the lights, what few functioned overhead, went out. The shadows shifted, and we weren't alone anymore. I didn't see them at first, not clearly, but I felt them. The weight of invisible eyes pressed down on me. Every breath became a struggle, like I was inhaling time itself. She began to speak in a language I didn't recognize. It was rhythmic, haunting. The words curled through the chamber like smoke, clinging to the walls, stirring the silence. The temperature dropped. My breath turned white. And then, I heard them. Not screams, whispers, thousands of them all at once, some pleading, some crying, some murmuring names I'd seen in the diary, scratched into the walls below, etched into the memory of the ship. One voice cut through them all, male, young, clear. "You left us." I looked up. A figure stood at the far end of the pool. Not Isla. It was him. The other me, the crewman. He walked slowly across the tiles, his boots echoing with every step. Water pooled around his feet, even though the pool was dry. He stopped in front of me and knelt down. We locked eyes, and then he placed something in my hand. A key, heavy, cold, tarnished with age. "You can open the door now," he said. "It's time." The shadows thickened, the whispers surged, then collapsed into absolute stillness. The candle went out. Darkness consumed everything. When I awoke, I was alone. The pool was empty, the ritual items gone, the key still in my hand. I made my way through the ship in a daze. Every hallway looked sharper, as if someone had adjusted the focus of the world. But the Queen Mary was different now, quieter, like a storm had passed. As I reached the hatch, the one I'd forced open nights ago, I paused. It was sealed shut again. New locks, new chains, but I didn't feel the need to open it. That door wasn't mine to open anymore. Back in my stateroom, the radio crackled to life. One voice, Isla's, but this time, her voice sounded older, weathered, distant. "Some ships don't sail on water," she said. "Some sail on memory, on pain, and some passengers never leave, not because they can't, but because they mustn't." The radio went silent, and I sat there, staring at the key, still wondering. Had we freed them, or had I been bound more tightly? Later that night, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror. For a moment. I didn't recognize the man staring back. His eyes looked tired, heavy with remembrance. He wore the same uniform I'd seen in my visions, and he smiled. Not kindly, just knowingly. The next morning, I left my stateroom, made my way across the deck, and stood at the railing, staring out at the harbor. The sun was rising. The Queen Mary looked peaceful, as if nothing had happened, and maybe nothing had. Maybe it was all a fevered dream, a hallucination brewed in isolation. But as I walked away, I felt the key in my pocket. Heavy, real, unmistakably mine. If you thought this tale was chilling, wait until you hear what's lurking in the next state. Hit subscribe to MindFuel and fuel your nightmares with every spine-tingling upload. They say time heals all wounds, but what they don't tell you is that time also remembers, that it stores things, tucks them into corners, into rooms, into the bones of old ships, where the metal groans at night from the weight of what it's seen. They don't tell you that time has a voice, that it whispers when you're alone, that it waits until you're far away from the place you swore you'd never return to. And it calls you, not with words, with memory. It's been nearly a year since I left the Queen Mary, since I walked off that ship as the first morning light scattered across Long Beach Harbor, like the sea itself had finally exhaled. I didn't look back, not once. But the ship followed me, not physically, not in the way you'd expect. But it found its way into my sleep, into the silence between thoughts, into the way certain floorboards creak in buildings nowhere near the coast, into the hiss of old pipes or the sudden sharp knock of wood on metal that jolts you awake for no reason. I'd see her, the ship, in dreams only. I wasn't always myself in those dreams. Sometimes I wore the crew uniform again, patched and sweat-soaked from wartime labor. Other times, I was Isla, staring at something unseen in the engine room, lips moving in a language I'd never learned but now somehow knew. But most often, I was someone else entirely. Someone who never left the Queen Mary. Someone whose name wasn't written down. Someone whose screams had long since faded into the steel. I started recording what I remembered. The diary helped. Yes, the diary. I kept it. I tried to donate it to a museum at first, but the moment they opened it, the archivist's face drained of all color. He set it down and refused to touch it again. So I took it home. I thought maybe it would stop the visions, maybe writing them down, getting them out of my head, would anchor me to the present. But the diary. It didn't like to be ignored. The pages turned on their own, and new ink appeared. Always after I dreamed, always after I remembered. Sometimes the handwriting matched mine. Other times, it didn't. I started getting calls, emails, messages from people who had stayed aboard the Queen Mary after me. One man said he awoke in the middle of the night in stateroom B340 and found a uniform draped across the chair. My uniform. A woman said she heard a voice over the radio that told her to watch the water line. Another, an employee, claimed the boiler room was sealed without explanation, though none of the staff had orders to close it. Each story echoed something I saw, something I felt. It was as if the Queen Mary wasn't done with me, or worse, as if I had brought something from her. I tried therapy, tried isolation, tried denial. Nothing worked. The key is still in my possession. Some nights, it's heavier than others. I keep it in a drawer, tucked beneath old sweaters I never wear. I thought maybe if I buried it deep enough, the memories would settle too. But recently, I've noticed something, a change. The key's no longer cold, it's warm. And sometimes it moves slightly, like it's trying to turn itself. The worst part, I still hear her, Isla, always just before I fall asleep. She doesn't warn, she doesn't threaten, she just says the same thing, over and over. The door was never meant to close. I don't know what it means, not really, but I'm starting to believe the Queen Mary isn't just haunted because of what happened on board. She's haunted because of who never left. And maybe, just maybe, some of those souls never left because they weren't supposed to, because they remember, because they're waiting. I've shared all of this now, not because I need understanding or sympathy, but because you need to know. If you ever step aboard that ship, if you feel something watching you in the corner of the engine room, if the lights flicker even though you're told it's just bad wiring, if you hear footsteps in the empty pool at 3 a.m., or whispers through a radio that hasn't worked in decades, don't ignore them. Don't tell yourself it's your imagination. And above all, don't take anything with you when you leave. Not a keepsake, not a photograph, not a key. Because you won't just be carrying metal, you'll be carrying memory. And memory, as I've learned, is a living thing. It follows. It waits. And Tracy, it's bisao. If you thought this tale was chilling, wait until you hear what's lurking in the next state. Hit subscribe to MindFuel and fuel your nightmares with every spine-tingling upload. They still come, even now, long after I stepped off her decks for what I thought would be the final time. They come. Families, tourists, skeptics, and thrill-seekers, all of them drawn to the RMS Queen Mary like moths to an ember that refuses to die out. She's a museum now? Yes. A hotel. A relic of history, resting like a beached leviathan in the harbor of Long Beach. But for those who've stayed the night, or wandered too far from the guided tour path, she's something else entirely. A warning, a whisper in steel and shadow. Over the years, the ship has learned to wear a mask, to pretend she's just old and weathered, her odd creaks and groans dismissed as the aches of aging metal. The stories, they say, are exaggerated, campfire fuel sold to tourists who want their skin to prickle. But the people who've walked her decks alone in the quiet hours of the night, they don't laugh, they remember. There's a woman, Tracy Mendez, who came from Arizona last year with her teenage daughter. They were staying in one of the upper-class suites near the bow just for a weekend getaway. Tracy thought it would be fun. Her daughter loved ghost stories. But on the second night, at precisely 2:14 a.m., they were woken by the sound of water rushing beneath the floorboards. Not dripping, rushing, like the entire hull had opened to the sea. She said it was deafening. the kind of sound that doesn't belong on a stationary ship, docked and dry. When she tried to get up and turn on the lights, her daughter screamed and pointed to the far side of the room. There, just beside the vanity mirror, stood a man in a soaked Navy uniform. His skin was gray-blue, like someone who'd been lost to the ocean. His mouth didn't move, but both women heard his voice clear as day. "She won't let us leave." Tracy had never run faster in her life. Security found them huddled in the hallway, sobbing and drenched in ice-cold water, though every pipe on that deck was dry and no sprinklers had gone off. They never returned to collect their luggage, but they weren't the only ones. The reports pile up. Every week, Ghost City Tours receives another handful of emails, some hesitant and skeptical, others frantic and breathless. People who've seen shadows cross the hallway near the engine room, where Isla once stood for hours, whispering names no one recognized. Visitors who claim the elevator goes to decks that no longer exist. There's even one story about a child, a little boy no older than 7, who wandered from his parents during a tour and ended up near the swimming pool. He was found minutes later, completely calm, sitting cross-legged at the pool's edge. When asked who he was talking to, he pointed and said, "The lady in the white hat. She said she was waiting for her son." The boy's mother fainted. She recognized the description from an old family photo, her own grandmother, who died decades ago after a voyage aboard the Queen Mary. Some skeptics claim it's all just mass suggestion, that when enough people hear a story, they start to imagine things, that it's groupthink, easily explained by psychology. But those who've felt the cold grip of a hand that wasn't there, those who've woken to footprints trailing away from their beds, those who've heard their own names whispered over the intercom system, even when the power's been cut, they know better. There's a growing theory among paranormal investigators, one they discuss in quiet circles and rarely in public, that the Queen Mary isn't haunted in the traditional sense. She's aware. They believe that the ship herself remembers every name, every death, every secret, that the layers of time have collapsed in on her, and that every visitor, every single person who boards her decks, becomes part of her memory. Some say she chooses who stays and who gets to leave. The psychic mediums who've been granted access to her lowest levels, places off limits to the general public, have come back changed, pale, silent. Some refuse to speak of what they saw. One of them, Marla Finnegan, was found 6 hours after a séance, curled in the fetal position beneath the communications room. She had scratched 3 words into the steel wall beside her, over and over again. "Don't wake her." To this day, no one knows what she meant, but the whispers haven't stopped. The Queen Mary sleeps during the day. She lets you walk her decks, take your photos, sip your drinks at the Promenade Cafe. She lets you laugh. She lets you forget that you're standing inside a monument built on death and memory. But at night, when the laughter dies and the halls go still, she listens. And if she recognizes you, if your soul carries an echo of something once aboard, she remembers, and she watches. And maybe, just maybe, she decides that you finally come home. So if you ever visit her, if you ever find yourself walking alone past stateroom B340 or lingering too long by the sealed boiler, room door, if the lights flicker and the hallway stretches just a little longer than it should, don't run, don't scream, and whatever you do, don't answer if someone calls your name from behind, because on the Queen Mary, you're never alone, even when you think you are. And some voices were never meant to be heard again. You've heard the stories. You've followed the footsteps of a lone traveler whose journey through the Queen Mary was meant to be a simple brush with history, a passing curiosity. One night, maybe two, a little excitement, a little thrill. But the ship had other plans. Because she doesn't just haunt, she absorbs. Every scream, every whisper, every desperate prayer to be left alone is swallowed into her metal bones and sealed behind the rivets and rust of time. Even now, long after our traveler tried to walk away, the Queen Mary is still whispering. The crew may be gone, their names lost to history and folded into the cold, gray ledger of wartime records and maritime accidents. But their echoes remain. You can hear them if you know when to listen. Not in the day, but in the in-between, in that quiet sliver of night when time forgets to move forward, when the lights flicker once, then die altogether, and you find yourself staring into the darkness with the sudden understanding that you are no longer alone. That something is staring back. And now you know what waits behind the locked doors and the rusted bulkheads of California's most haunted vessel. But what if I told you this was just the beginning? Because the Queen Mary, as horrifying as she is anchored in place. Her ghosts are contained, her passageways mapped. But there are places across this country that are not so kind. Places where the wilderness swallows entire towns without explanation. Where the land itself seems to remember blood and betrayal. Places where the rules of day and night no longer apply. And where those who vanish are not forgotten, but claimed. We're headed to one of those next, a place deeper inland, far from the ocean's reach, where the forests are so thick they drown out screams, and the shadows move with a memory older than this country. If you thought the Queen Mary was unsettling, wait until you hear what's been happening in the backwoods of Oregon. There's a trail out there the locals don't mark on any maps, a path the park rangers won't speak about. They say the ground is wrong, that compasses spin, that time bends. But more importantly, they say something walks it, something that doesn't belong to the natural world, something that waits for the foolish, for the curious, for the unlucky. And we're going there next. So if you're brave enough to follow, if you're the kind who steps toward the sound instead of away, then subscribe to MindFuel. Turn on your notifications and fuel your nightmares with every new upload. Because this country is older than we pretend it is, and the stories buried beneath its surface, they're waking up, one state at a time, and Oregon is calling.